This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's meeting of the Budget and Performance Committee, where we resume our investigation into capital projects in London. Yesterday, we looked at funding. Today, we're looking at speed and cost of delivery. But before we get to that exciting main item this morning, we have a little bit of housekeeping. So firstly, can I just ask everyone to make sure your phone is turned to silent? And secondly, can I ask our clerk, Hannah Barlow, whether we have any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chairman. In accordance with Standing Order 8.2 and with permission of the Chairman, Assembly Member Baker is attending the meeting as an observer.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Baker is the Chair of the Transport Committee. Just if anyone's curious why that might be, why she might have opted to come and join us on the Budget Performance Committee today. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? No. And so that brings us to item 3, which is our main substantive item this morning, a discussion on capital project delivery, faster, lower cost, more consistent. And to that end, can I welcome our excellent panel of guests this morning. We are joined here in City Hall by Dr. Alexander Budzier, who's the CEO of Oxford Capital Projects, and Ben Hopkinson from the Centre for Policy Studies. And joining us remotely is Gareth Dennis, who's an engineer and writer on railways. So if I kick off with a sort of broad opening question. So start with you, Alex. What are the key principles that underpin low-cost project delivery? Oh, yes, sorry, the little picture of a person.
Found that out. Okay, great. Low-cost delivery. I think where we've seen sort of in the past low-cost delivery, there were a couple of ingredients to make that happen. So very specifically around what actually happens before construction starts. I think it's one of the things that make things quite expensive are the long, prolonged planning periods or development periods that projects are going through. And that, of course, drives cost up, as we're then talking about long costs of inflation, et cetera, that nominally drive up the cost. So there is a real element there about us and how can we plan better and more strategically, and that means more continuously. So we are having an issue with these stop-start models of infrastructure planning and project development. So that features into sort of, do we tie that into a strategic plan? And we can probably later touch on these things about us, and can we find a different model of deciding on these infrastructure projects rather than doing it all in one go, but putting that into phased developments. And then thirdly, I would say, is in particular in the front end, that in this country we definitely have an issue with the consenting processes that drive up the cost and the prolonged timelines of projects. So thinking there about how we can improve that, that will be a major cost driver.
I forgot to turn my own mic on now. Thank you very much. We'll be obviously exploring these in more detail as we go on. It's useful to get an sort of intro. So Ben, what are the key drivers of low-cost project construction?
Well, I think I agree with what Alexander was saying about the consenting process. Certainly, the time periods involved are quite long. And if you think the longer a project is in flight, the more likely it is that some global shock might affect it. So your Brexits, your COVIDs, your energy crises. So when you have a really long delivery timeline, you're more likely to have these external shocks that drive up the costs of construction. There are a few other ones, like inability to make trade-offs, for example, when choosing design. So wanting the very best, which would be great to go on, like the very best tube line in the world, but it's often so expensive to deliver that you'll never actually build it. So I'd rather ride something that is cheap and able to be constructed, rather than this kind of gold plating. Then you also have kind of long environmental review processes, which is especially ironic considering that these are often green transport projects, which help to lower carbon emissions, and that's the biggest threat to a lot of our species. And we also have inefficient and fragmented construction sectors. So our kind of largest construction firms are a lot smaller than European equivalents. And that's partially because our planning system is uncertain and long, which means that they're heavily reliant on subcontracting. And one other thing is often there's a lot of changes and turmoil in the government project managers. So if you're kind of constantly swapping in and out civil servants every 2 years, they're not able to master the contract and kind of hold the companies that are delivering to account.
Thank you very much. That sounds a lot there we can explore. Gareth.
Yeah, thank you. So, lots of things there that are said that I do strongly want to, I'll briefly echo, which is, certainly the complexity of the supply chain is a key factor that's consistently picked up at a national and regional and urban level as a key challenge. The number of subcontractors and subcontractors and the size of the overall delivery bodies and major contractors, the tier ones as they're often called, is certainly a reasonably unique UK issue. Certainly in terms of the capacity to deliver the planning side of things, planning regulations is one thing, but I often point out that actually if we had the level of kind of city and urban civil service capability that we had in even the 90s, those planning issues wouldn't be so much of a problem because you'd have enough highways officers or transport officers, for example, to kind of support these things to move forwards, as well as the capacity to have project managers and things. So that skills base within and talent within the client organisation, TfL or others, is really key, as is the kind of the civil service capacity, not necessarily national civil service in this instance. One of the things I would slightly challenge is the idea of gold plating, not necessarily because it's completely wrong, but because Crossrail's a really good example of this, in that so much of the discussion was, well, it's gold plated and we can pull this out of scope, and then we get a system, a £25 billion railway that is already at capacity. So I'm always wary of the gold plating claim. I'd say that that's less critical than, for example, the lack of overall strategic direction that London is probably better than the rest of the UK, or certainly better than the rest of England at, in terms of having that strategic picture. I think back on the mayor's strategy from quite a few years ago now. That's been watered down a little bit because of COVID and the move towards much less longer-term funding settlements within London. But the strategic view is critical, because if you don't have that pipeline of work, not only do you end up delivering larger, big projects to try and hit a business case rather than little elements that fit together as part of larger, part of a larger whole. But also the supply chain cannot, it overprices because it's expecting things to get whipped out from underneath it at the drop of a hat. It also can't get the right size of skills, the right size of equipment, and all those technologies. Also, in a city like London, the space to put that kit midway through construction. So, compounds, it's difficult to maintain expensive city centre compounds if you don't have a guarantee that there is going to be a project to use them or a pipeline of projects to use them. So I think that strategic oversight, that plan, having a plan and the commitment behind it, even if it's not full financial commitment, but a commitment of, well, we might not have these to be funded immediately, but they are absolutely part of the plan and we should be preparing for them. It is really key to cost. So for me, it's that strategic oversight that's kind of the number one thing, is making sure you paint that picture of what the system needs to look like in the long term.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think that takes us on to what was going to be my second question, which is, in a world where we probably aren't going to get a very large cheque from government to fund transport projects in London, how should TfL then think about the way it approaches these sort of, these big infrastructure planning questions? So if we go in the reverse order, Gareth, because I think you started on that.
Yeah, well, actually, it's one of the things that is possibly pertinent to the previous session's discussions, but it's something that I think TfL should be empowered to be bolder on, which is rather than the private sector getting the value uplift from new public transport infrastructure, is that TfL and London itself should be looking to actually buy out areas and have those as long-term assets for public development, space creation, and getting the uplift to then pay for the infrastructure itself. It's sort of more in line with the Japanese model of railway infrastructure. So actually, TfL or one of the other mayoral offices actually owns the space around a station, for example, buys it where it's cheaper because there's no or lesser infrastructure, and then the uplift from the infrastructure doesn't then mostly saturate into the private sector and then come back as a nominal levy, but actually that London takes that land and gets the benefit entirely itself, and therefore gains a larger amount of capital from that to then make the justify the previous investment, or perhaps then make the next investment, as well as getting an ongoing revenue to pay for the upkeep of that bit of infrastructure as well. So I think being bolder in that vein, so actually going, we can and should be owners of the land around our public infrastructure, whether those are railways or even improved bus routes, is a route to unlocking a larger sum of capital, and therefore allowing you to be more forget central government, or at least not worry quite as much about the lack of interest from central government in expanding London's transport infrastructure, and really plan ahead on the basis of, actually, we will buy this land and then get that benefit to pay for the infrastructure. So, there's a few other things I could say, but I'll stick to that focus point now and say that for me feels like a very strong opportunity that should be explored more than it has been in the past.
Got you. Thank you. Ben, in a world of constrained funding, how should TfL approach the design of its projects and its approach?
Well, I do think there are a couple of things that the mayor could do, actually. If the mayor was kind of sufficiently bold and wanted to push ahead a project, say the Bakerloo Line extension, for example, you could do a mayoral development order around the corridor, and then also mayoral development corporation. So those two combined allows the mayor, or, well, the development corporation acting on behalf of the mayor, to create a local plan which could be very high density, given that it's supported by new local transit. And in turn could also set a higher rate of community infrastructure levy to raise more money from the developments that happen around it. The one kind of small critique, and it's not that big, around Gareth's point, is I'm just a little bit concerned about the kind of necessary CPO powers that might be involved with trying to own a large chunk of land around stations. So a mayoral development order and a development corporation, in turn, can work with the existing landowners so that you're not kind of running roughshod over them, which might raise a few of the political costs.
Understood. Thanks. Alex.
I think to your question about, I absolutely agree. And when we're looking internationally, things like, say, for instance, in rail and property development model, where the property development on top of rail station and around rail station has paid for most of the transportation network. For instance, in cities like Hong Kong, that has worked very well to raise the funding, make this all bankable through loans and bonds, and then being executed by, in their case, the railway operator, the MTR Corporation. So that kind of works for smaller scale projects like in a congestion relief projects, smaller extensions, upgrades to railway station and so on. And I think that points to, as both Gareth and Ben just said, it's about this whole thing about us and how can we, what are actually the levers that London has to capture more of the value of these projects, and therefore, well, A, that would provide financing, but also that would make these schemes more attractive when it goes through the business case, and they would face less political headwinds to go through. Because if we're looking at the business case, say, for instance, for Crossrail, etc., that things like amortizing the benefits that come from the property development for Crossrail 1 were not fully allowed. For Crossrail 2, sort of, before it got cancelled, went through that stage that some of that could actually be calculated as the benefits on top of those mythical travel time savings. But the other big thing about us, and what I think is sort of the big problem at the moment, looking at TfL, but also, you know, it's not just London, it's across the board, is that the funding constraints that are faced at the moment lead to a massive loss of talent. So rather than developing schemes or developing ideas for future projects in order to cut cost and to meet its budget, you see a lot of that kind of that talent, that engineering talent, leave the door and go. So it's kind of, when we said multiple times now, sort of that kind of strategic vision of, you know, how does it all feed into a big picture? Unfortunately, you know, that is also lacking at that level where, you know, not enough schemes are being worked in at the idea stage. So it's all like, you know, let's stop all of this because it's not that important. Use limited resources to focus on limited schemes at the moment that are a bit further in development, and actually redirect the budget into where it's needed in operations and maintenance of the assets that we already have. And, you know, that creates that kind of like, there's nothing there, you know, in 5 years and 10 years time, you know, again, sort of is that stop-start thing of, you know, where's the schemes in the next generation that we need to talk about.
Thank you very much. That's it from me for a moment. Assemblymember Hall.
Thank you. Do you actually think that the Mayor, as the chair of TfL, is doing enough to consider alternative ways of approaching infrastructure and how we build it in a cost-effective way? Who would like to take that? Ben?
Happy to. I mean, I think certainly more could be done. I mean, my kind of idea of a mayoral development order and a mayoral development corporation, in turn, would be a way taking the current powers that the mayor has and kind of applying them to its fullest extent.
That would work. Anybody else got? Yeah.
Yes, I would echo that. That's I think the mayor isn't doing enough within the elbow room that they have in terms of you know, legislative power. There's definitely more. Exactly as kind of Ben has described. I think there's a lot more to be done, but also going across. You know, the mayor could be doing more to look across disciplines, if you like, as well. Is thinking more about housing and the relationship between housing and housing targets and the costs associated with that, the costs associated with social care. And transport, because they're utterly interlinked, and there is value to be unlocked as a whole there. It's not, you know, we have to think about mobility in isolation. It's important. The advantage that a city like London has is the opportunity to think about those things in a more integrated way, and I think there's a lot more that could be done on that front as well.
So, I mean, he seems to be thinking that it's the remit of the government more than his own remit. That's certainly what's coming across. Do you think that's a mistake, Gareth?
Yes, I think that our cities across the board, but certainly with London being ahead of the charge in terms of its devolved power, can assert more. Obviously, there are there's political to and froing about what powers sit where. But actually, I think the mayor should be doing everything they can within the powers that have been given to them democratically. And I think there's a little bit of a gap between what's being done now and what could be done.
Yeah, I think there's a big gap, but yeah, Ben?
Yeah, to be fair, there are a few extra powers that the mayor ought to have that the government should consider devolving to them. I would say chief among them, the ability to grant Transport and Works Act orders. So that's the planning process that a light rail or a tram or an underground scheme tends to go through. And right now it's often a kind of 2 to 3 year period of back and forth between the mayors or TfL or other kind of promoters across the country up to central government and back. And to be honest, I think the mayor is best suited to figure out what's best for their region. I mean, they're elected on a pledge to build infrastructure, but right now they're not enabled to actually deliver it, which means that mayors often function as campaigners rather than builders. So getting all of the powers to approve, to fund, and to manage at the right mayoral level would allow a kind of upswing in development.
Thank you. He's certainly not delivering on his pledges. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks. So we now move on to our first sort of main section, which is looking at international cost comparisons. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you, and good morning. Well, one of the difficulties of these meetings is that even quite early on at question 3, you find a lot of the questions have been answered already. So we're going to have to be a bit sort of nimble here. So I think it's been established that transport infrastructure delivery is more expensive in the UK than in other comparable countries. So how does London specifically fare in international comparisons? Anybody who wishes to on this one.
Sure, I'm happy to pick that one up. So I would say infrastructure delivery costs in the UK are certainly higher than a lot of European competitors. Not necessarily I would say the UK is not the worst internationally. That prize goes to America.
Yep.
But it is the case that UK undergrounds are 2 times more expensive per mile than projects in Italy or France, 3 times more expensive than Germany, and up to 6 times more expensive than projects in Spain. Barcelona, Bilbao, Copenhagen, cities across the Nordic world, Paris, have all delivered metro lines for 2 or 3 times cheaper than what we were doing with the Jubilee line and the Northern Line extension. And it's about to get worse. So the Bakerloo line extension, the cost estimates at the top end were £8.7 billion in 2021 prices. Well, that's £10.8 billion inflation adjusted for today. And that's a massively high amount for a line that's not running through central London, through the very kind of congested tubes, does not have a kind of large number of interchanges with existing lines, only has a couple. And that's 3 times more expensive, inflation adjusted, than even how we were building with the Jubilee Line extension and the Northern Line extension. So you can compare that. Madrid is building a cross-city line right now, Line 11, they're extending it. And it's being built at less than £100 million per mile. So right now, the UK and London specifically is building 20 times more expensive than Madrid is.
I can add to that. So my team has worked with the National Infrastructure Commission on the international comparison, which showed that the UK in the benchmark, and there was a national benchmark, is more expensive, exactly like that, and I mean, all of the conclusions we already talked about, in terms of fragmented supply chain, the lack of strategic planning, the consenting process, that we have a problem there, not so much with the planning, and the challenges around being good sponsors, being good clients on the civil service side and managing these projects well. Those were the things highlighted in that report that we supported there. But we also did for the city of Dublin, who's currently planning a Metrolink, so their first metro line, a comparison where we were, by members like yourself, very specifically asked about, we heard that the Madrid Metro originally built over 15 years in 3 5-year big phases at a cost point back when, so we probably have to double this now, sort of at around 30 million per kilometer. So that's the cost of a tram. That's not the cost of the Jubilee line, which I think was 240 million per kilometer. So far, still the most expensive metro ever. And when we looked into that, there were some elements to that that were very clearly about. It happened in Madrid. It is very specific to the context of the city, as very specific to the context of Spain. Then there's also things that it happened a long time ago. Some of these things we couldn't do anymore around procurement rules. I mean, they can be changed, but that's a big problem. that helped back then, but there are certainly some elements where they have taken the lessons and some approaches that make it much easier and reduce the cost. So all the stations there are cut and cover. So you dig into the ground from up. They're very shallow. They're shallow as can be, not as deep. If you use Crossrail, right, some of these extremely deep underground station, all of that drives up cost. So simple designs, standardized designs, so getting away from designing for iconic impact to having a productive asset. And the other big thing around this was that all those lines, particularly Madrid, were helped by good political decision-making. So firm commitments over a full building of the system that were then ring-fenced, not touched upon, budget for the full build-out over 15 years, so 3 election cycles that were ring-fenced, and therefore not part of the political discourse. And also, quite importantly actually, that land and property was not part of the project. So there was a separate entity, the Madrid Development Corporation, like your idea, that actually acquired the land and property beforehand, did the brownfield developments, so decontaminated the land, and you can always say, as a city, if you buy a brownfield site, make them fit for your use, you have the options what to do with it. That doesn't necessarily need to be tied to a certain scheme. That can be done separately. There can be fundings raised separately, and then that can be allocated to that scheme. So there's a little bit about that. Here in this country, we do land and property as part of it, compulsory purchase orders, or if we don't want to upset our electoral base, then we pay over the odds and more than market rates to keep them happy, right? And all of that drives up cost. That in other countries, they deal particularly with that big LNP, land and property element, differently.
Thank you. I see Gareth wants into.
Yeah, just really wanted to emphasise the point that the comparison, as often is the case, the comparison with other systems, Madrid's a really good example. The top population of Madrid is about a third of the population of London. Population densities are in the majority of areas that much lower, and exactly as Dr. Alex was pointing out, the ability to actually build a cut and cover station in Madrid, you can do that. You simply wouldn't manage that in London. It's not a possibility. It's certainly something where you can do it. You should think about doing it, and indeed that where we could, we built surface level stations for Crossrail. But yeah. So and the other thing, of course, is it's not that having a bog standard copy paste station solves these cost problems. That's a really strong thing I want to emphasise. Is that the main reason we have these much higher costs in the UK is because not just the supply chain, but the wider economy is that much more fragmented than in Spain. We have that many more interfaces that require lawyers, that require commercial managers, and that adds enormous amounts of human cost, human resource cost, before you get to actually building the thing in the ground. We absolutely need to understand why those costs are so high, but the main reason that things cost so much in the UK, the main reason, is because we don't build much. This is fundamentally, we spend a lot of money and don't manage to build very much, and actually it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation that we need to, what is more important, building the infrastructure that our society needs or bringing the costs down? I would say let's build the infrastructure and get plans in to build infrastructure and bring those costs down accordingly, with the pipeline of work to deliver the shape of infrastructure that London as a city needs to get its people moving around.
Thank you. That was going to sort of neatly bring me on to the next point, which is I was doing some Googling and looking at the which I appreciate isn't necessarily always an accurate indication, but I was looking at the Grand Paris Express, 38 billion. 4 new lines, 2 extensions of existing lines, 120 miles of new tracks, 68 new stations. And yet, here in London, we're looking at maybe a small extension to the Bakerloo line, or maybe a bit of an extension. Are we too timid, or do we simply lack the capacity to deliver grand scale? Alex is absolutely, not Alex, Gareth, sorry. I should know Gareth, because that's my name. Gareth, over to you.
Yes, absolutely, we lack vision. It's just so exasperating to see. Paris is a wonderful parallel. Londoners, you should all be much more jealous of Paris. I'm amazed how, and particularly not least as there's a sizable, the biggest French city outside of Paris is London. I'm amazed that there isn't more anger in London as to how limited those ambitions are. Paris is just doing incredible things, not just in terms of public transport, but obviously, of course, in terms of public realm in the city centre, it's wonderful to see. But the ambition is there, and this is true for the rest of the UK. You know, we can't even deliver one high-speed rail line. Where is our ambition? You know, where is our ambition? Because costs are one thing, but the ambition has to come first. You have to excite everyone about what can be achieved. The fact that we dwell on I'm not saying that costs aren't important. That is certainly not the case. But costs are a thing that should be perfunctory to the story that we're trying to tell about how people move around in an incredible city like London, where public transport is already incredible in parts of the city, not the whole city. The ambition should, the idea that we're arguing over the Bakerloo line extension, a thing that should have happened decades ago anyway, as if it's some sort of enormous, massive, scary thing, which unfortunately, according to the costs, you might be forgiven for thinking it is. When actually it should be one in a very long line of major upgrades happening across the city, including radical new things like, circular. I know it's wonderful we put the Superloop bus in, but actually perhaps that should have been something more physical and substantial, a bit like the work that's going on in Paris. Yeah, ambition. We should be getting excited about the future that the sort of mass transit can be delivering the city, because London has such a legacy of showing what that looks like and what good looks like in terms of what can be unlocked in a city by ambition. So yeah, ambition certainly lacking. Perhaps not uniformly, but I would say we can talk and shout bigger about what can be achieved with public transport, certainly.
Thank you. Ben or Alex?
Totally agree with that. And when you see where that actually has happened, so Paris, for instance, they just hosted the Olympic Games. Always that's a massive catalyst, because there is a massive deadlines. That doesn't make things cheaper, but at least it gets stuff done. And so we see that in many cities that use these kind of large-scale events as something of a trigger point to bring together a lot of bottom-up plans with top-down plans, and also create much more integrated plans that you have for urban redevelopment, urban cleanup of specific areas, right? Paris as well, isn't sort of, they cleaned up their river at the same time. So a lot of things come together because suddenly you have a major focus point that galvanizes to create a vision of what we're going to do with this, how we're going to capture the benefits from these things. And that is certainly something, when Gareth was just saying, isn't, talking about individual schemes here or there without a unified vision that really excites people and a little bit of urgency behind it, that is certainly something that is lacking. And the flip side of this, through my job at the university, also engaging a lot with the government in Hong Kong, they have now created a plan for 2040 plus. And the vision there is to increase housing by 50%. So grow the city from 6 million people as there at the moment to 9 million people in less than 10, or in a little bit more than 10 years, maybe over 20 years, 15 years, something like that. And that requires integrated planning, transportation, social infrastructure, housing, wastewater, freshwater supply. All of these things, all of these different government departments need to fall into line. And that can only be done by a strong vision. It's different, of course, the Chinese political system. Once a decision is made, takes, again, forever there. Their process is the other way around than others. So they talk about this for decades, but when they say go, then everybody goes. We announce schemes first and then wait for the judicial review. So we have the system the other way around. And so, they're not necessarily faster with the planning and stuff like that in the front end, but there you can see how a big, bold vision that actually is well placed and embedded within the different delivery bodies that need to come together, then can actually galvanize and do that. And I dare say you don't have to bid for the 2040 Olympics to make that happen.
Thank you.
So I think ambition is clearly important, and selling a vision is very helpful for getting people to buy in politically. I do think that we should be careful before kind of committing to this grand vision without getting some of the regulations and planning correct first. So one of the things that Paris can do that London can't is charge up to 2.85% onto employers' national insurance. So it's a payroll tax that is controlled by the regional government, and they can then use that to fund infrastructure upgrades and increasingly infrastructure operations. So that kind of fiscal devolution is just completely not the case in London. So if we rushed ahead with a vision to kind of recreate the Grand Paris Express in London, you would, first of all, spook the Treasury. because they would then be on the hook for any cost overruns, and that's completely fair. I mean, the kind of number of visionary projects that ultimately are cancelled because the Treasury is the one that has to bear the costs. The list is very long. So some of that fiscal devolution is incredibly important because then it allows the city to actually pay its way, and then it's their money, not just the money that kind of is the country's, so we don't actually have to care that much about how we're spending it. So getting the fiscal situation right is incredibly important, and Paris does it a lot better than us, and that has enabled them to have this really ambitious transformation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. Assembly Member Hall.
Gentlemen, this is so fascinating. Thank you very much. One of the things, Gareth, you are selling the vision and the opportunity and everything else, but cost does matter. Because you can't do anything without money, and you've got to sort the money out. So whilst I would buy what you were selling because you're such a good salesman, at the end of the day, we do have to look at costs. That's just a simple fact of life. Most of my questions were actually going to be around the Madrid example, which you've given all the answers before I deliver those questions. But if all three of you could take one thing from the Madrid situation and take it as a lesson that TfL should learn, what one thing that they have done to be so successful at a reasonable cost would you say to Sadiq Khan and TfL that they should look at when we're looking at this infrastructure? Who wants to go first? Gareth.
Yeah, I'll just briefly talk about cost. I agree cost is important, but I think opportunity cost is more important than capital cost. Is that what is London losing by not having a world-leading transport system? In terms of the Madrid question, my answer is quite straightforward. The commitment to a long-term plan. That's the most important thing that Madrid has that we don't see in the UK.
Thank you. Ben?
So I think I wrote a kind of very long read about the Madrid Metro expansion, and the thing that stood out to me was that the projects were all 4 years long, and they all started right after a regional election, and they all delivered the projects and opened up the lines about a month before the next election. So the biggest thing to learn from Madrid is that you need to give regional government the power to approve projects, to fund projects, and to manage projects. That's how you get the political buy-in that leads to the government being bold, visionary, pledging to deliver these expansions, being elected on that vision, delivering them, and then being able to be re-elected on that vision. Right now, if you had a mayor in 2028 who said, my big plan is to deliver the Bakerloo line extension, I think the time period involved is probably about 12 to 13 years by the time you go through planning and you go through business cases and environmental statements and consultations and asking central government for permission to build, and then you actually get to building. That means that there's no way that that politician would ever be rewarded for that. So why care? I mean, why care about making the politically costly trade-offs, telling people, actually, no, we are building this, and I'm willing to take on some political cost for that, because you're never going to be rewarded politically. So the big lesson in Madrid is give the powers at the right level, then force political entrepreneurs to come up with grand plans, be elected on them, and then judge them in 4 years. If they've delivered, they should be re-elected. And if not, then maybe someone else, a new political entrepreneur, could be elected and deliver in their 4 years. That's the biggest lesson from Madrid, and that underpins everything else that they've done.
The problem is the planning would have to come before the person was elected, and the planning would have to be underneath whoever was the mayor at that time. But I absolutely, it is around a political cycle. There's no question about that. It's a shame we can't get over that. But I'm so pleased to see that you recognise that, because so often people don't actually see where we're coming from as politicians, and understandably, because it does get in the way, for sure. Alex?
To add to that, I would say is then the other key lesson I always took away from this is that it goes two ways. So Madrid Metro, talking to the team, and Manuel Melis, who was the CEO or president of the expansion or the initial project, he said that his condition to start the project was a direct line to the mayor of Madrid, and when they needed a decision, that decision would be made by the mayor within 24 hours. And at the same time, that the mayor would not back off if it upsets people in Madrid. So it goes kind of in two ways. We can deliver that to them, they made those promises, but that also requires that real support of the politician, particularly in the speed of decision-making, should any troubles materialize on the project.
Fascinating. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. This has been really interesting. Ben, you said earlier that the mayor's acting like a campaigner and not a builder, and that really struck me. I wanted to go into what is going on outside of the UK in terms of structures and systems that's making these projects more affordable, faster to deliver, and obviously we've touched on all of that, particularly around fiscal and political devolution. I've heard so far it's simple design, it's procurement, it's good political decision-making, good luck with that. It's about dealing with regulation and planning and a commitment to a long-term plan. Is there anything else going on outside of the UK that you would say in terms of structural design is really helping projects?
I mean, I think you did a pretty good job of covering a lot within that list. I think the main thing is getting the incentives right for politicians to then be thinking about how do I deliver, not how do I kind of balance all of these kind of competing stakeholders. And in some ways, if you're staking your reputation on the line, that matters a lot more than, you know, it might be delivered in 12 years, but I've got to consult the lawyers and I've got to consult loads of people along the line several times. That's the kind of most important thing. And in some ways, the kind of move in the UK recently has been to try and depoliticize infrastructure projects. And I think that is kind of a misguided thing. In some ways, infrastructure will always be political because you're interacting with loads of people along the line, you're giving some benefits out, and there are some costs to building infrastructure. So in some ways, trying to de-risk it by saying, oh, it's not a job for the politicians to care about, it is, because it matters immensely for how the economy can grow in the region, how people can get around, but also how people are affected by the new lines. So really having some political guide is incredibly important, and to get that, you need to have the powers and the funding and the responsibilities at the right level.
Is there a danger, and it's not a loaded question, it's a genuine question, but if we start to put infrastructure into electoral cycles, that there's then pressure about safety or about the efficiency of a project because actually you're planning to try and make it complete before the next election as opposed to the longer time that the project might need?
I think we can do more about that, right? So it's not always about the grand opening ceremony, and we know that, well, thankfully it's not yours, but I think the most expensive railway station in the whole country is Luton Parkway, because I don't know if you've ever been there, it's not much to talk about, but it was opened by the Queen and somebody booked the Queen very early on. And so a lot of money was thrown against this whole thing that the Queen actually can open something that looked reasonably finished. And that made that the most expensive railway station ever in the UK. And so there's a little bit of that, right? Does it need to be the grand ribbon-cutting ceremony? How can we actually celebrate the infrastructure that we have while it is being developed? So, and I think there is kind of really that interface of how can we create those political incentives, right? And I also think it's kind of strange to talk about that way, but when I look into Asia, China in particular, they're much better at this. You can celebrate a lot of things that happen. It doesn't need to be the great ribbon-cutting ceremony. You know, the first trees arrived, the first landscaping, the first park. You know, where has that been celebrated on Tideway? You know, that everybody gets together for every single little bit and creates that kind of those kind of political incentives around that. I think it's not about the getting it from start to finish. There's enough to celebrate in between. I think that's one element I wanted to add to that, and that we can definitely do better in those things. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to add there, I think you're kind of not expecting to be able to build in 4 years like Madrid. There are kind of too many processes that you have to go through, and fundamentally, I don't think our construction sector is ready to deliver in 4 years. But that doesn't mean that you can't get started building in 4. And I think that's a very visible commitment. I don't think voters will really care that the Bakerloo Line Extension had its Transport and Works Act order delivered. Oh, yay, let's celebrate that. No, it's more, let's celebrate the first spades in the ground. Let's celebrate the tunnel boring machine starting. That's very visible. And then hopefully you can see, hey, actually, we're improving the city. We're getting better. On the safety point, French mayors can build a tramway in 2 years after 2 years of planning. I don't feel unsafe riding a French tram. Likewise, when I went to Madrid, I didn't feel unsafe riding the Madrid Metro. I think it's a perfectly modern system. So I really don't think that we have kind of safety concerns there.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And Gareth, if I can come to you, particularly around this point about political and fiscal power.
Yes. So, so the safety element, I'll come in, given that my background as an engineer, it's something pressures and the pressures to even subconsciously make decisions that potentially impact not so much on the final product safety, but also on the safety of workers, those delivering the infrastructure. That is why we have safety standards, why we have approval processes for our supply chain, and why we try to inculcate that culture of actually, people can put their hand up and say, we're getting to the point where pressure is making this unsafe. Pressure can be a good thing, particularly the backroom office stuff before you ever get on site is actually the pressure to get stuff happening it's before shovels go in the ground that there's a lot where that pressure can be very good to make people make decisions rather than go around in circles and not make decisions. So that's kind of the first thing I wanted to address. The second was on, I think one of the key things that comes back again uniquely in the UK is the lack of devolved power. Ben has very, very very clearly laid out why and where that power must be kind of grown and very much devolved away from central government and away from Treasury particularly. Treasury, I have my own problems with Treasury, but Treasury is just not wired to care about the things that people on the ground care about. Let's just put it as bluntly as that. Like they have a different view of the way that the country works to people to cities that have a much closer understanding of the fabric of communities and society. And that kind of ties into a couple of things that I think at a city level, one of the things that we've not touched on yet, but it does definitely go near some of the things we talked about in terms of strategic vision, is the fact that big targets such as housing targets, such as mode share targets between different types of mobility. So saying and London's been pretty successful at this in terms of, but there is still not a key core, we will achieve this mode share by this decade or by this year. Those targets can be quite good in driving the need to understand how much infrastructure you have to build to deliver the target, and therefore what needs to happen when. That can be quite useful, and that can be tied into political cycles as much as it sits above them. So it kind of satisfies both sides of the equation on that front. So I think there's perhaps more to discuss on that element of how those targets look, how they are assured, to what extent they are enshrined into into law or into the kind of the legislative agreements that the Assembly sits under. The other thing I wanted to touch on is that you could write a blank check tomorrow to deliver all the London infrastructure you want, and it wouldn't be that much quicker that we would be building it, because there is this core number of people who build this stuff, design this stuff, that we don't have in the UK. Because we don't deliver enough infrastructure as a whole, we don't have the skills to all of a sudden start building 2 or 3 metro lines at once in the country, let alone more than that, let alone one, frankly. So the rate at which we deliver this stuff is slower because of the fact that we aren't building more at once. Paris has had this acceleration, but as a result, they've built their skills base to design, manage, and actually physically construct the stuff. So it's really key that we don't lose sight of skills. That has to be integrated into the story. And unfortunately, as we've seen on a national level with things like the National College for High-Speed Rail and other places, you don't go, we're going to build a college. In fact, the Tunnelling Academy in London's a good example. You don't go, we're going to build an academy to train these wonderful apprentices without there being somewhere for them to go and work. So that you have to think, basically the projects happen first, or the pipeline happens first, and then you understand what level of skills, engagement, and where that needs to happen to deliver those people. So I want to kind of draw us back onto skills as part of a key theme on delivering this stuff, not just to a decent cost, but at all, frankly.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Ken. Just actually finally, without putting you too much on the spot, do you have any examples that are getting this really right, this kind of cohesive skills plus long-term planning and infrastructure?
I think we've seen to be honest, I come back to Paris and it's just that momentum they've built up. They've got the capability, not just in terms of the civil engineering, the project management, also the client knowledge it's not just at a city level, because obviously the regional structure of Paris, the region, as it were, also having the client skills, the skills in your back rooms as well to be making sure this stuff is happening. So Paris is a very good example of it. China, at a more strategic level, has a view of what they want their cities to look like. And therefore, they do a lot of the, exactly as was wonderfully elucidated, they do a lot of the umming and ahhing, but then once they've decided on that, their delivery of what they want that city to look like, what they want mobility to look like, and crucially, the relationship between housing and other public services and transport, they understand how that picture looks. And again, a lot of that comes from having a well-funded city civil service. That's a really important factor in that, is having the right client organisation to tie that stuff together. And relate it back to the big strategic targets. Sorry, that was a bit of a slopey shoulders answer, Councillor Polanski, but I hope you won't mind hopefully some enlightenment in there.
I thought it was a great answer. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks very much. Also, don't feel bad about having a pop at the Treasury. Tony Travers was here yesterday waging a sort of one-man war against the lack of imagination, I believe, was his central criticism. Assembly Member Mahfouz.
Thank you. And I think I'm just going to take a bit of challenge in terms of Gareth's point about lack of ambition, because actually we have a mayor who does have a number of major infrastructure projects in the pipeline that he wants to deliver for London. And actually, Gareth, there is an 80% target of modal share from TfL's transport strategy by 2041. So that exists. But what seems to be the challenge is what is the challenge really in sort of day-to-day office environment almost. So two things with delivering change as a member of staff is, one is you have to have trust and sign off from your manager, in this case the Treasury, and the other one is obviously having the resources and the capacity to be able to deliver, and that is very much about the revenue raising abilities. So when we talk about the Grand Paris Express, we've talked about, Alex, you've already talked about that ability to have the special transport tax in place to bring in the funding. With Madrid, they've got that ability to have more capture from the land value in terms of property development. We've obviously seen the English Devolution Bill now published. What is, in your mind, sort of currently missing from that would allow us to unlock the ability to start delivering these projects?
Oh, the main thing missing is the devolution of the Transport and Work Act orders. I've got a report coming out on this soon, so keep an eye out. But it's getting the ability to approve projects locally. We probably do also need a little bit more fiscal devolution, but you could be, I guess, bolder given the current kind of mayoral development orders and development corporations and mayor community infrastructure levy to fund a lot of these things locally. I guess I'll be kind of slightly controversial here and support the Treasury, because a lot of the incentives for them are they are kind of giving their credit card out, and they don't have really a lot of control over how you spend the money. So you need to have these kind of massive business cases, because once they grant the power, they really can't control the costs. So it's kind of completely understandable why they're a little bit concerned about giving their money out and approval, which is, I guess, really underpins the argument that we need to raise more of this locally than coming from central government. That's not to say central government shouldn't have some contributions, maybe up to 30 or 40% of a project, but really the majority of the funding ought to be local.
To that point, right, and if you look at the DfT and their rule change, particularly after the trams, Sheffield, Manchester, Edinburgh, went so horribly wrong, right, they changed their funding rules in terms of that local authorities, whoever they are, need to provide 15% of the total capital cost themselves. For other local schemes, it's 10%, so they upped the skin in the game for the local authorities, as well as they said that whatever is put into the contingency pot to pay for risks, local authorities need to pay 50% of that. And there was clearly sort of that a reaction to seeing projects being lowballed, submitted for central approval, and then going pear-shaped. And suddenly, it is to the Department for Transport to pay for all of this. So the trust in the system is relatively low. At the same time, I think as in sort of the work that recently been sort of the reform ideas that the Office of Value for Money has been suggesting around this funding, I think there's some really sensible elements in there, because at the moment also the way the system works is that you go there and say, we want to build Crossrail 2, or we want to build the Bakerloo line extension, right? Please, can you commit that you will be on the hook for 11 billion? You know, however we're going to do that. And so the approach or the recommendations, let's see if they will be accepted, is to actually go for a phased approach and say, actually, at this juncture, we might only be on the hook for 100 million over the next 10 years to advance some of the planning for some of the design. Right? We're not talking about immediately committing to the whole life cost of building and operations and probably even decommissioning, if that's part of the thing, forever. And that's not the ask we're making of Treasury. So you can clearly see, you know, how some of the historic failures around, capabilities and so on have eroded that trust and taken it away, have led to different rules. But also, I would say, sometimes how the system works and the asks we are making is we always ask for the whole thing, and then it sounds super scary to anybody who would look at that.
And sorry, Gareth, just before I bring you in, just specifically on the devolution bill, anything specifically that you feel like should be in there that currently isn't?
There's a lot that's really good. Yeah, having run through that devolution bill in some detail, there's a lot that's in there that's really good, actually. But I want to see more power being wrestled away from Treasury. Exactly as Ben has talked about, there's a lot more that should be. You know, central government should not have the power of veto over any infrastructure that's being delivered at a city level, or certainly shouldn't be so ready to exercise it. Let's put it that way. I think there are lots of opportunities to just strengthen the fiscal capabilities of cities. London sits in a position where it's lucky that it has a massive population and a very well-established sense of itself in terms of its powers. But I also want to see the same level of ambition to other cities, which is not so relevant to this group. But I think, in a way, London can be quite pleased with where it's at and the deal that it gets. But we've seen that slip back a little bit in the last 5 or 6 years, and I want to see that kind of. I want progress, not us going backwards, as you know, London going backwards as a city in terms of its relationship with central government.
Thank you. And just super quickly, you've all mentioned really in terms of that share of risk sitting with the Treasury. Is there a way of financing? Obviously, we've talked about PPP, PFI previously, yesterday in particular, but anywhere of sort of sharing that risk more so with the private sector and perhaps giving that due diligence assurance because they are contributing more or taking more of the risk as part of those project deliveries. Is that something that you've seen elsewhere?
Well, there's also enough, throughout the UK, enough cities, counties, etc., and special measures where that hasn't quite worked out so well to devolve those powers, particularly around real estate development, too far. So I would always see that as a different element of this. When I think about it in different models of financing, particularly around the risk, I think it's exactly the opposite thing. So what makes projects very, very expensive, to the point earlier, is if you want to raise the finance privately, and then these risks are put into the capital markets. So I think roughly when we're thinking about nationally now for for Hinkley Point C, about half the cost we have to pay as bill payers for that electricity is because of interest rates, because the risks were fully placed with the financial markets. You know, we could have paid less. We could have paid half if we hadn't transformed this. At the other end, Thames Tideway, great model with the government support package that was in place there, where actually it's not so much that the government is paying for the capital cost, but the government is underwriting the risk. And so that the exposure of the capital markets is ring-fenced, is capped, and therefore that worked really, really well, was very favorably financed, and so not the mess. So I think there is something there about when we're looking into the future and different funding models, one of the keys of government is that it can take risk. If we were to transfer that into private sector, that would just make things more expensive.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Actually, just on that point about risk and coming back to Paris, who is apparently now our new poster boy, let's imagine that big new rail infrastructure project in Paris overruns. Do we know who ultimately is underwriting that? Is it the mayor of Paris who would be on the hook to fund that? Is it the equivalent of the French Treasury, the I don't know, Trésor, whatever they call that? Because obviously that has a big impact, doesn't it, on, you were talking, Ben, about if, let's say, London as Paris could authorise its own projects. Obviously, the counterparty risk, effectively, the Treasury is a sort of silent underwriter of those projects. And so that's the reason they want to exercise that veto, is that they don't want to green light huge amounts of risk that they don't control, but they are responsible for. Does anybody know what? Because obviously that would be a factor in. Oh.
I believe it's the case. It's the Ile-de-France is the one that's underwriting it, so the regional government.
Yeah. And so that would be what if the cost overruns, then ultimately Ile-de-France would have to put up tax or borrow money or something like that.
Yes, or a kind of cut back on the project.
Something else, yeah. Okay, thanks very much. Assembly Member Georgiou.
Thank you to all three of you. And I feel like we've covered most of this question. So chip in if you feel you've got something additional to add. So this goes to all three of you. So what has gone wrong with transport infrastructure delivery in the UK in major projects in the past? What can TfL learn that can be applied in the London context? So I guess if we start Alex, Ben, and then Gareth, if you have anything to contribute.
I think we already talked a lot about things, right? So it is about creating that pipeline, featuring into that vision, thinking, making more of those connections around these interfaces, and as well about looking for that kind of backing that you will upset some of the people and some of the, not everybody is happy about infrastructure being built. So I think that is certainly something there. And thinking about us and, sort of better approaches of value capturing. And therefore, how can we improve on on these kind of finances that, from the outset, it looks a lot like learned helplessness. It's very easy to blame Treasury. They're not very far away from TfL as headquarters, but, culturally, they're very, very far away. And so it's very saying, we can't do this because of these guys over there, and preventing us from doing that. And I think that's definitely not the right approach.
Thank you. Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing is just the pipeline. We've mentioned it before, but we had this kind of hugely expensive, very impressive delivery of Crossrail 1, and then nothing. no kind of Crossrail 2 following on. Even though it is very expensive, London has such a significant housing shortage that if you were able to liberalise planning around the stations, you could unlock an absolutely massive amount of value. So the money is there. I mean, there's lots of finance willing to be invested. It's just our planning is wrong, our kind of priorities are wrong, the political incentives aren't there for the mayor to kind of keep delivering because these are such large, massive projects that take so long. But that means that we've kind of got crews up, we've got them ready and mobilized and skilled, and then we don't do anything with that. We just build one line. I mean, HS1, for example, a lot of the people that built that weren't then consulted on HS2. So we have a kind of a skills base in the UK, but we don't use it. And then if you don't use it, you lose it.
Okay.
Yeah, on the last point, it's just a stat on using and losing skills. In the last year, in the UK, we have lost 7,500 electrification engineers of a workforce of 10,000. So that's 7,500, that's 3/4 of the skilled people who deliver overhead electrification of railways are now mostly entirely out of the railway sector altogether, now in things like energy and working for National Grid or whatever it is, and they will never come back to the railways. So we've lost 3/4 of our workforce in a year. That's what the UK is extremely good at, is just treating with contempt its very hard fought for skills base and then wondering why things cost a lot of money. But I want to give a slightly more, I'm just going to let that sit for a second, but there's been so much that's been said already that are really good answers. I don't want to repeat some of those, so I thought I'd take a slightly different tack in answering the problem with the infrastructure delivery across the UK. And I'd say that the right major thing that we need to emphasise as a problem is storytelling. We do not tell the story of why the infrastructure needs to exist, what it can unlock, and why it benefits people at an individual level. One of HS2's main failures was that all this singing and dancing at the start talked about rebalancing the economy and all this rubbish that means nothing to most people, means absolutely nothing to most people. One of the things that was a key failure of HS2 was its inability to localise its benefits, to describe to an individual how they would personally benefit from the construction of a national intercity high-speed line. And so there are two factors that storytelling are really important for. One of them is building the political and public buy-in for that story and therefore the infrastructure associated with it. And the other is the inability to articulate the business case. So if you cannot tell the story, that doesn't just include telling it to the public, but it also includes articulating that story into the business case such that it looks good to those funding it, whether it's Treasury or someone else. HS2, perfect example of this. Its main benefits, which was releasing capacity in the existing railway, were not factored into the business case at all. So its main benefits, by a substantial margin, simply were not included in its business case and continue to not be included in its business case. That's not just me saying that. That was picked up in Alan Cook's stock take back in 2018-19 and was picked up before then and has been picked up since by the NAO and others. So storytelling is really important. Engineers like me need to get far better at storytelling. The managers and the leaders of the projects need to get better at storytelling. The board level staff the C-suite staff need to get better at storytelling, and politicians need to get better at storytelling. That storytelling piece is extremely important.
Thank you. Now I've got that one out of the way, I can ask the questions I really want to ask. Actually, there's one point that you made, Gareth, which one thing that useless politicians and bureaucrats don't talk about is the fact that these things should be built for people, right? By the way, I'm about to say something about academics, and that doesn't relate to you two. So many things come from academics and so-called experts, and it's all on the periphery. These are just intellectual exercises for a lot of people. In reality, and I'm going to come to a good example later about one of the colossal failures in this space. By the way, I'll have to very much disagree with you on HS2, Gareth, but leaving that to one side, and I think Ben and Alex spoke a lot about trams, and trams are one of those things that doesn't really get talked about too often in London unless you're in Croydon. But one of the things, I love trams. I just came back from Florence, and it was extremely easy. I think if you're going to take up road space, I think that's one thing you could use that benefits almost everybody. So why then do we not look at So Ben, you mentioned it takes 2 years, or it's taken 2 years. I forget which country or city it was. Was it Madrid? Was it Madrid? Trams. Right. Okay. So if we're using that example, so 2 years, probably nowhere near the cost of infrastructure projects and the time span. Therefore, you can take that political capital if you're a mayor or senior politician in implementing that. So therefore, is it not better in doing smaller projects that can be delivered quickly, on budget, you get the political capital, and it's something that people really want to use? So, for example, rather than waste £120 billion on HS2, reverse some of the beaching cuts, and go to bits of the country where people actually want to go. Thoughts?
I think the one thing with that, which is the interesting thing, is having a vision that lends itself that these small steps actually build on top of each other. So when we're saying St. Trams, I always think Dublin is also a good example where there is a continuing expansion of the tram network. So if you do new housing, first put in bus rapid transport systems. Electrified buses, bus connections. Okay, that will enable transport solution for new housing immediately, but on the heels is then the plan to extend the tram network. If that now in Dublin gets too congested as well, right, the next thing will be thinking about underground railways and metros. So there is that kind of these are stepping stones that we're delivering. It's not just about doing small stuff, but having that vision of what would happen if and how is this going to evolve over the future. I think that is something where we can do better of balancing that need for, or sort of the immediate needs that need to be satisfied with some of that long-term thinking, and instead of just placing big bets without that kind of balanced portfolio approach.
It's not compulsory to respond on what is it. Does anyone want to contribute on that point for me? Yep, Gareth?
Yeah. actually, you've made my point about storytelling really beautifully there. I'm not going to get into an argument about HS2, but there is a really nice, it's a really good case study in the importance of the storytelling piece, which I'll come to in a minute. But first, I want to say, actually, yes, the smaller projects, HS2, another good example, HS2 should never have been delivered as a single major project. There should have been here is the high-speed rail map of the UK we expect to see in 2050, crack on, and we'd have seen various bits of it being delivered simultaneously. So delivering it as one major project was never a good idea, but unfortunately it had to be to build a business case to get Treasury to say yes. So yes, smaller projects are a neater way, but they have to be as part of a strategic whole. But also you have to understand that trams don't do what metros do. So, for example, you look at Manchester, the Manchester Metrolink is wholly inadequate to deliver the mass transit needs in Manchester. It's a very good system, but they are trams. They are essentially a more efficient form of street transport. So they're kind of just better buses, which is fantastic.
We know what they are. No, I get that. Yeah.
But so I suppose the point is that it's understanding that actually Manchester, for example, needs a full metro system. And likewise, London has use for trams where you have extremely congested bus corridors, but actually the density of London is such that actually pretty rapidly you'll find that you probably actually need a metro line, not a tram system. So I love trams. Trams have absolute use, but in London, actually the density of the city probably lends itself away. So yes, the smaller projects, but they have to be part of that bigger whole and understanding what the right solution is. The reason I want to talk about storytelling is, so you talk about local lines, the reason that you can't just reopen those lines or open those local lines is because our existing railway network, the main lines where those lines connect through to get to the regional centre, are utterly congested. You can't run any more trains on those lines. The East Coast Main Line's a perfect example. It's completely congested. The December timetable will render every last smidgen of timetable capacity gone. That will be it full, and reliability is going to take a 10% hit as a result. And that's why you needed the big project. I'm not just going to say HS2, but this works on a smaller kind of city level as well. You needed HS2 to create the capacity in the existing network so you could do things like reopen local railway lines. So again, and that's not your failure to understand that. That's the failure of those pushing HS2 to have not explained that point. And that's true on a city level, is that if you don't explain what the purpose of the Crossrail or the Crossrail 2 is, without explaining how it impacts on the cascade down through the other tube lines, through the bus services, and actually tell the whole story, you can fail to build that political will, or you can lose the political will without the storytelling. So storytelling is really key, and it's the telling the story of the big picture that allows you to then make delivery actually in smaller chunks through smaller projects.
No, and as I say, Gareth, I think on that storytelling point, I think you're right. I mean, a good example of this is I remember during the coalition, I think it was Nick Clegg, I forget which, might have been Sizewell C or whatever, but he basically said right at the beginning of the coalition, I'm anti this nuclear power station because it won't be built anytime soon. But I think but actually only a few years ago, actually it would have been built had the planning permission been granted at the time. So, but once again, this comes back to a storytelling point, doesn't it, Gareth? Which is Sizewell C is meant to provide cheaper, cleaner energy for the people of Britain. If you look at Silvertown Tunnel, absolute waste of money, in my opinion, and I say that as a Conservative, where it started under a Conservative mayor and ended under a Labour one, so it's not a political point. We're now tolling 2 tunnels, so, people on regular commute saying, well, who was this thing built for? It wasn't built for me. So what I'm saying is, the storytelling angle of how do you link it back to what benefits, I guess, Gareth, you would probably respond.
There's a democratic point here. There's a democratic point here. Silvertown's a good example, right? Silvertown, forgive me, everyone, but it was a project desperately hunting for a solution, and you can see that congestion has basically not been helped by the construction of the project. It's not great. It was a project looking for an answer, and in a way, having to have good storytelling exposes the gaps in where the story is not coherent and it cannot be made coherent, exposes the gaps in a project, and therefore allows the democratic process to hopefully and ideally then correct accordingly. So storytelling is important in kind of a two-way street, in that if you fail to make that story, then actually there is an opportunity for the democratic process to correct course and make a different decision. In the case of Silvertown Tunnel, that didn't happen, and I think there's some introspection to be had on that front. But you're right. It's a two-way street. Storytelling is really important, both to get the mucky civil engineering to eventually happen, and to happen in a more accelerated way by politicians not nitpicking, getting in the way, but letting it get delivered. but also in ensuring that the politicians are equipped to tell that story to their public, and the engineers have a role in that as well.
And final question, because I think in response to my first question, Alex, you made a comment that, and this is going to sound dismissive, and it isn't, but you made a comment effectively saying, yes, some people won't like what's happening around their area. Well, sorry, before I carry on, did I get that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, public anger. Right. But then, to me, and I'm not saying the way you phrase it, there are many people, including in this building, that have a view that is very dismissive of people's local concerns. You know, you've saved up for a very long time for your dream home. Well, all of a sudden, you're going to have a CPO in that area, as we're seeing in many planning applications across London at the moment. So you've got to be turfed out for market value, whether you're a business, a homeowner, whatever. And people's concerns are dismissed. So therefore, you know, politics does have a role in this, quite frankly.
Yes.
You know, HS2 is a very good example. All these politicians were all for it until they realised where that track was going through, and all of a sudden they had a lot of angry constituents. So, you know, there's that sort of part of it as well.
Yes, and I think that is a really difficult problem, and probably an intractable problem that we can't really solve, because you can say, just to this, right, HS1, not a great beneficiary thing to the UK, right, but well, forever loss-making, but the benefit to cost ratio, I think, of the St Pancras development in a report that I saw that did a post-audit was 16:1. So the urban regeneration that happened around St Pancras has delivered dramatic benefits to London, right? But go there to the people that worked there before King's Cross and St Pancras got redeveloped, right? They are displaced, you know. That nighttime economy is completely moved away, and now there's Google's shiny headquarters there and stuff like that, right? So who are you building the infrastructure for? I think that is a really difficult point, because you might say, you know, we can uplift all these things, we can build shiny bits of housing, etc., and then all what we're doing is we're displacing these communities that are living there because they're crowded out, because others go in, right? So there's a little bit of that, and obviously we're not helping ourselves by sort of then rowing back on saying, yes, there was things like affordable housing to be built. Look at the Queen Elizabeth Park. There was initially targets about 50% affordable housing built in. You know, that then became sort of redefined as, okay, shared ownership is okay. You know, suddenly you find out that to get shared ownership in that place is now 300,000 as sort of, you know, the price to buy in, sort of, you know, and actually the people that this was initially conceived for, they've been crowded out. They now live outside Zone 3. So I think there's something there in terms of, you know, what is the vision? You know, does everything need to be gentrified? Does everything need to be expensive as Marylebone? Is that our vision for London? And how can we create a different vision?
That might not be the vision, but that's the way that it is.
And then the second point to this,
I'll give you an example of that in a minute.
That I think we will upset people. And if you look at London Euston at the moment, I think it's one of the biggest things that is holding that bit of HS2 back, is that there's definitely different opinions of what should be done between Camden Council, between Network Rail, who's operating the railway station, between TfL, who's operating the buses, what's below it. You know, the taxi rank, it's this whole saga in its own right, because there's another constituency there. Then you have the oversight developer. And in that project, nobody had said no to anybody else. It was a gravy train that came. Everything was paid for by the DFT. And to anything in the sections 106 was always yes, yes, yes. You know, we will build this, and they are going to pay for this. And then suddenly they find out, oh, we said yes to so many things. Right. It hasn't happened, right? So that's what I meant with, actually, we need to have a process where we can say, you know, not everybody will benefit from this, but what are we going to do about alleviating the disbenefits of it, and how do we manage that?
Ben?
I mean, if you try to please everyone with an infrastructure project, it is going to cost almost infinity, and it will never be built. At the end of the day, this is why politics is important and has to be involved in the infrastructure planning process. If you, politics at its kind of most fundamental is about who gets what. So there are circumstances that people are not happy about what happens, but we live in a democracy, and if we vote for a leader who's pledged to build an infrastructure project, it ought to be built. So Madrid has a good example here. when they were engaging in local communities where a station might be built, they would have informative sessions, but not fully consultative. They would kind of offer, if you have any suggestions, because you obviously know your local area better than us, like station entrance, for example, if you want to, on this block or this block, let us know. But if it costs more, we're not doing it. So at the end of the day, they were voted in to deliver a project, and that project might incur some local costs. But because because a majority voted for the leadership in that circumstance, they were empowered to deliver on behalf of the people. So at the end of the day, politics has to be involved, and you have to recognize that these infrastructure projects serve the good of the city, hence why people voted for them. And that doesn't mean we trammel roughshod over people's rights, but kind of fair compensation for CPO. I think that's, that's enough. We don't need to do anything else besides that, because people are getting kind of more than the market value of their home and compensation for moving. To try and please them further is just throwing money down the drain.
Right, Gareth, very briefly.
Yeah, very brief. So, yeah, I agree with a lot of that. And yeah, Ben, absolutely. There's two things. Like, firstly, it comes back to my localise the benefits point, in that you need to be thinking not just, well, we've got this wonderful, we're going to have this much economic benefit for London, but like, how do all the individuals benefit? And that includes thinking about the big picture. So not just the one line, but also what does that then do for freeing up space on bus services and so on, things like that, and other public services. But also consultation. Ben, yeah, again, really nicely highlighting the fact that we have a nasty habit in this country of consultation processes being both perfunctory and also only basically accessible to people who don't have a job and can look through 200-300 pages of really poorly formatted consultation documentation. That's not always the case. There's some fantastic points of light on very good consultations. London has lots of very good consultations. Nottingham had a very good one for their city centre redevelopment recently. There are points of light. But consultation should be seen as an opportunity to build that democratic buy-in, to decrease the number of people who are put out and have their livelihoods upturned with no seeming benefit. I think that's... So it's not just... Where I will disagree with Ben is it's not just that we, give them their fair market share and pat them on the back and push them out, but actually making sure that as many people in that community who are still going to live in that community are explained what the point is, get that buy-in, definitely things where they can make where they can make decisions about things like entrances, designs, get them involved in those processes nice and early to get them feeling like, oh, this is a project that we've actually meaningfully had some say over, and make consultation accessible. So it's not just the few people who have time to sift through all that documentation can do, that actually it's really accessible, not just through town hall meetings, but online, but knocking on doors, the whole raft to make sure. And that requires funding of the city civil service, of course.
Gareth, I'd just say respectfully, I don't think you've ever spent time as an opposition councillor in a council. I've yet to experience a single consultation from any mayor, any council, where they actually care about the result or listening to what people actually think. I've never seen it happen. But I'd leave on this one point, and I'd actually I know my colleagues here that are in administration pretend that they care about consultation, but I've never heard once a response. Good, I'm glad. So final point, I think one good example, I think that matches what you're all saying. So if you look at Tower Hamlets, Greenwich and Newham, basically everywhere surrounding this building within eyesight, I think have been the perfect example of what the three of you want. Sort of follows the DLR, lots of development on previously underused land, lots of affordable housing in the site. So just leave you with those examples. If you're taking a walk around, actually that side of the road over there is very good examples. So thank you.
Okay. Assembly Member Mahfouz.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going to bring it back to the area of questioning, which is around the cost of infrastructure delivery. And I'm going to take Gareth's suggestion of telling a quick story. And we talked previously about international comparisons, but actually this one is a London comparison. So I'm going to take you to Zone 4, out west London, to an area of Greenford. And we had the previous mayor had said that he was going to introduce a lift at Greenford Station, spent £2 million, and I don't know where that £2 million got spent, but nothing changed. Said they didn't have enough money to deliver it, and so we got some independent consultants who work on delivering infrastructure projects domestically and internationally to come up with proposals that were costed. Their proposals came back with a fully deliverable lift at the station of only £2 million, a fifth of the cost that TfL were quoting at 10. We challenged TfL until we got the prices down to 2.2 million. I said, look, I'll pay the difference. Let's make it happen. And we did. And that was only the second station on the Central Line to get a lift. But that is where we can challenge internally within TfL, where the costs, we're not talking about comparisons with Madrid or Paris, but actually reducing the cost by less than a quarter of the original cost just by challenging TfL on where that extra fluff, whatever it might have been. And now we have a fully delivered, accessible station transforming people's lives in West London. What lessons have you seen from TfL, that was an example from just over a decade ago, that actually can be implemented in terms of reducing cost and delivering more accessibility projects, for example, and more infrastructure projects in the city? I see Alex nodding. Sorry, Gareth. We'll start with you, Gareth.
Yeah, so accessibility is something I care extremely deeply about, and it's something that, as a whole country, we're extremely bad at. I come back to, I'm not sure we've actually used the words rolling programme, but basically having a strategic view allows you to have a rolling programme. And one of the things about a rolling programme is that if you have a set fund annually to deliver this work, it becomes reasonably straightforward to say, well, within that, we will have some performance indicators that say we expect the number of accessible stations delivered for this amount of money every year to increase year on year by this percentage. And that drives and improves behaviours, but also critically, it kind of will happen naturally by the fact that you have we've talked about it before, a team that does the work consistently. These are still delivered, AFA schemes, whatever you want to call them, new lifts or other accessibility improvements are still basically delivered as individual projects with their own individual team that gets convened, procured, and then dissipates after each individual project. And that's not entirely, TfL as a client organisation have elements that continue to deliver each, but very much on an unofficial basis. And having a team that delivers these at scale overall is something that nationally and regionally and in terms of London needs to happen. But another factor in that I have experience in, having had a 10-year degree plus in design consultancy, is that the incentives for consultants to reduce costs are not really there. Consultants don't have any vested interest necessarily in reducing costs in what they propose. The consultancy is inherently risk averse. And I think this is where having a stronger in-house delivery body for some of this design work might help. So actually, whether it's fully to detailed design without getting into the weeds of engineering, whether it's right the way through to delivery and detailed design, or whether it's having a stronger early stage design delivered within the organisation. But I think there are benefits to actually delivering less with design, private design consultancies and more within TfL, because then you can actually harness some of that, those efficiencies of having the same team delivering and learning from each additional delivery of an AFA scheme, for example. You can parallel these for other things. So I think that's twofold. Like the rolling programme and also where the design is delivered are key factors in that.
And to add to that, escalators and lifts are notoriously expensive, and I still can't get over the fact that every single escalator on the TfL is hand designed. Somebody sat down and designed that thing exactly to the millimeter specification of whatever the gap was that needs to be bridged, right? And therefore, it's expensive to maintain. It's non-standardized, absolutely fragmented. Obviously, TfL, as they probably, I don't actually know how many suppliers they have, but probably not more than one or two. And of course, these will charge and say, well, our lifts historically always cost this much. Well, it will be expensive, and you then say, well, actually, we ask some other people, some other suppliers, they do it for a lot less. And I think that has to do with the clienting capability. And what Gareth just said around this and that, in many projects, government actually procures a lot, but we act as if we're completely open to the market, right? So there's no industrial strategy for construction. When we're thinking about, is there a strategy to office buildings, office blocks, office rooms, right? That's probably 90% of what government procures is a room that is 8 by 8 meters or less. And, how are we actually influencing what that should look like, what that should cost like? So I'm sure that individually the escalators, every single escalators cost a lot, cost way too much. But as a total sum, not big enough to care. So, right, there will be nobody who's actually working with the supply chain to say, and this is what we need to achieve, this is what we're going to do in the future, so we're just going to say yes to whatever the market says, right? There's a little bit of that where I think is that civil servants, our delivery body, misunderstand their ability to actually make the markets and transform the industry rather than just being passive takers of what's happening to them.
And just the only other point to add on that is it shows the importance of political accountability, of kind of not just taking the numbers that TfL comes up with as a given, but really challenging them. Can you go lower? Can you find another supplier? It really kind of has benefits there.
Thank you. I think, Gareth, you had your hand up. Was that the point Ben made?
I did. No, I wanted to be very specific and useful here, actually, because the bit of my day job is for Network Rail. The bit of the organisation within Network Rail that I work for owns the problem that is lifts and escalators, because they have been a serious problem for the national railway network as well. And I would just say that a huge amount of work has been done with the supply chain to kind of bring it forwards into kind of the world that our public transport sector kind of works within. Lots of really positive stuff. So I'd say on that specific point, it's just to signpost that actually is perhaps a session with engineering services within Network Rail on lifts and escalators and the cost savings, not just in terms of repair, maintenance, asset management, but also in terms of installation, massively reducing the cost of installation of lifts. Just well worth signposting that for members here. There's some really interesting and useful, very useful targeted learning gone on there. So something, and TfL are aware of it because there's been a lot back and forth. So I just wanted to signpost that, some very valuable learning there that will provide some value for London, certainly.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks. I think at this point we'll take a short comfort break of 10 minutes, so we will return at, by my watch, 11:40 a.m. So we'll be resuming with you, Zach. Hello, welcome back to the second part of our investigation into transport and capital investment delivery in London. And we resume with questions from Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you, Chair. Alexander, if I can start with you. So the former National Infrastructure Commission have suggested that infrastructure could be 20% cheaper.
Yep.
Is that realistic?
If you put a deadline on that, so I do think it would be realistic, and a lot of that has to do with capability building, that kind of supply chain, etc. And also thinking about, from, as Assembly Member Fu said, sort of actually engaging at a detailed level. So we reckoned, it's not going to. It is expensive, and that is a national view. So that's not, as you say, is not particularly clear for large urban areas. So London will always be more expensive than the rest of the country. But there are certainly elements there why that these things were a reasonable approach. And it's not going to make the UK a cheap infrastructure champion, but at least closing the gap to the next by some more sensible choices. I think that was, we fully supported that analysis or that conclusion that that is feasible to do.
I can see Gareth nodding online. I don't know if you wanted to come in there, Gareth.
No, I don't actually. Really, I don't have much to add on this one. I absolutely can be achieved. I think one of the challenges we have for infrastructure delivery across the UK is that the fundamental shape of our economy and the structures that we've decided to extract value from our economy are in such a way to make delivering things like real stuff like public services and real stuff like infrastructure extremely difficult. And we are exceptional in Europe in that sense. Compared to the rest of Europe, we have a much more atomised and fragmented economy with lots more moving parts and therefore many more interfaces, commercial or otherwise. So there's a lot that has to be unpicked that's pretty big, radical picture stuff. But there's also a lot that we can do in a more infrastructure sphere, and I think we've covered a lot of that already. But 20%, my view is that is absolutely achievable, but it requires some major commitments from central and city governments that don't look necessarily realistic at this point.
Cool. And we're back to bashing the Treasury. Ben.
I think we could be a lot bolder than 20% cost reduction. I mean, if you're looking at Madrid is building at 1/20th the price that the Bakerloo line extension's at. Now, I'm not saying we're going to get 95% cost reduction. I wouldn't promise you that. But only 20%, I think, is not nearly bold enough. So there are a lot of ways that we can learn from other countries, whether it be Madrid or Spain. I think one of the issues that we often have when we look at international comparisons is we think, oh, well, how does America do it? Because they speak English, so we don't need to kind of deal with translating documents or anything. But that's like looking at, we're really bad at delivering infrastructure. How does the country that is the worst do it? And let's learn from them. So I think we can totally beat 20% cost reduction, and there are examples out there, and we can learn from them. We just need to actually put it into practice.
Do you have a number that you think is much more plausible? I mean, maybe it's just plucking random numbers up, in which case don't do that. But
I mean, I think if we got closer to European average cost delivery, it would be about 50%.
Wow. Okay.
We're more than double, and that's not even just looking at kind of best-in-class delivery, whether it be kind of German trams or Spanish metro. So 50%, I think, would be very reasonable.
Alex, did you want to come in, though?
Oh, I was saying there's so much value left on the table. I mean, and there is so much out of historical context, right, sort of as a smaller state, et cetera, less oversight. But also some of the traditional practices here just insane, right? Why? If you go on a construction site anywhere in London, you find that all the traffic management signs are rented. And all the lifting equipment is rented from a company. You have massive amounts of capital programs here. You go on a TfL site and they rent this stuff constantly. I have no idea what margin they make on the people who rent out these traffic management signs, but there must be so many, right? But it is the thing to do. No construction company, not TfL, they don't own their own traffic management sign. They rent that stuff. If they need a cherry picker, they rent this stuff and get it delivered on site. They don't own these things. And you think, and nobody is challenging that. And I think there's a lot of that kind of things, a lot of small changes can add up to something there. And, it's that, it would require big changes at the macro level, but also micro challenges could totally get to this target.
Yeah, we had this conversation yesterday around public-private, and often it goes wrong, and then we ended up buying it in anyway. Gareth, I saw you indicate.
Yeah, no, firstly, it's reassuring to have both Ben and Alexander actually back me up on we need to radically shake up the structure of our economy point. I'm very pleased that to have that, not just me going out on a limb on that one. So, yeah, and the examples that Alexander gives are perfect on that front. I really wanted to emphasise a point now that might come up later that's really important, is that we must also get better at costs on the other side. By which I mean the benefits, the value, the opportunity costs of not doing these things. I think we need to get much better at understanding the value of this stuff. And it's the basic tenet of costs are easy, values are hard. Calculating costs, you get a bill of quantities, you put a number against each one, you work out how many people are going to build the thing, and you've got your cost. And okay, we might get that wrong quite regularly, but basically that's an easy process. Calculating value is something that is much more complex. It's much harder. It requires a lot more soft science, if you like. It's a lot less easy to get a grip on. And also the people who are doing that costing exercise are once again quite risk averse. So if you've got consultancies, it's in their absolute favour to really they can be quite precise on costs and say, well, it's going to cost this much, but they are very wary of saying of overamping. So it's safe for them to overamp the construction costs, but it's very risky for them to overamp the value of this infrastructure because they might be made to look silly if they get that wrong. Good examples of that being every single railway line that has opened, regional railway lines that have opened in Britain in the last 20 years. We just had the Northumberland line not even finished yet, with stations delayed for a long time, and its passenger numbers are only 2 stations open, the Northumberland line, passenger levels 5 times higher than predicted. And that's even just a basic passenger numbers level, not even thinking about the fact that the business case wouldn't have looked at the wider agglomeration benefits of that. So, it's and how much more would we have delivered if we'd spent 5 times more on that railway? Same for Borders Railway, same for all those sorts of reopenings and station openings that happen. We're very, very bad at looking at value and the benefits from this stuff. And perhaps we might kick ourselves out of it's too expensive to build anything, so we don't build anything, so it stays expensive doom loop. If we were better at selling that value and kicking things off on that front, that might help us to kind of break out of the doom loop, as it were.
Really well put. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks. Just strikes to me if 50% is a sort of realistic goal, then the storytelling around that is buy one, get one free, isn't it? Buy one, Crossrail, get Crossrail 2 free. Somebody member Harani.
Thank you, Chair. Just turning to the Arup greener, faster, cheaper model. Is that something that people have had a look at before, or have any views on how that could be delivered? Alexander?
I haven't. I always think about faster, better, and cheaper is probably not going to happen at the same time. And there were countless organizations, including NASA, who declared that the central mission, and then they completely missed Mars a couple of times and stopped doing this. So I think it's a really interesting element to come back to that in terms of how we frame the challenge. When we're looking into where successful infrastructure has been developed, it was never under the banner, we need to do this cheaper. The Madrid Metro example happened because they said back then we need to improve the health and safety culture. Back then, too many deaths in the construction site, different ways of procuring, different ways of building, simplifying design, all was done to build and kill fewer construction workers. So build safer. Same thing, Terminal 5, all the big approaches they did to do things differently started with the framing, we want to do this safer. Normally, a project like Terminal 5 would have meant 5 deaths in construction. They said, that's not acceptable. We're going to rip up the rule book. We're going to do things differently because we want to ensure there is safety on our site. Right. Now, if you pose the same challenge and said, okay, great, now Team Crossrail 1, build me Crossrail 2, but for 50% of the cost, that's probably not going to happen, right? That's not a framing, that's not a vision that will motivate any engineer to actually work on this. That will not motivate any decision maker. That will not, nobody will really strive for that. So I think there's something about what Gareth said earlier about this, in setting the right targets, doing the right storytelling of how can we make this happen, because, you probably have done enough and been part of enough cost-cutting exercises that if you tell somebody they just need to do it for less, you will never ever get there.
Ben, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I'm also not familiar with the report, but I broadly agree that just targeting costs is kind of a slight recipe for disaster if you're kind of involved in contracting and just going for the lowest cost without any idea of whether that's deliverable, whether there's technical merit to their bid, and what the kind of time span that you're looking at is. Because, of course, if you're just doing lowest cost, then you have the incentive for contractors to cut prices, win the bid, and then they could escalate them later. So, on the other hand, you can do cheaper, maintain quality, and build faster, which is broadly what Madrid did, because they're aware that they don't want to be subject to global shocks. So once the project gets going, build it quickly, avoid the kind of 20-year project that can then be rescoped or descoped or changed around. If you know what you want to build, kind of get on with building, and then you're not liable to these big shocks or big changes.
All right, Gareth?
Yeah, I am familiar with the Arup report, so I can speak with some authority on it. And actually, you can all be reassured that it basically just says everything we've spent the last 2 hours saying. So it sets out what they did was look at a range of projects. They understood where they could see, interestingly enough, road projects were more successful because there was perhaps more political impetus behind them and less meddling. Rail projects weren't. Because there was more strategic meddling and among other things. But it's interesting looking at the range of different projects. So they looked at these projects and they tried to pick out learning from those projects that could then be reapplied across the board. And actually, a lot of it is things that we have already discussed. So things like having a capable client, having clear sponsorship, prioritized outcomes, getting stakeholder engagement right, getting early, no regrets, enabling work done. Lots of things that really, for the most part, we've talked about already, actually. So without wanting to poo-poo on Arup's report, it's kind of stuff that we've all understood, and we could have another report written about. We all understand this stuff. Arup have put it into one report, but there have been lots of other, the National Infrastructure Commission have put it to others. I think Deloitte and PwC have written their own reports that say pretty similar things. We kind of know the answers on this stuff, actually. So whether it's Arup or others, I think the key thing is that we apply pressure both upwards to, for example, get powers over Transport Work Act orders, getting more into the devolution bill or continuing that journey, if you like, so building on the devolution bill, to get some of those powers centrally located so that those things can be fixed by London rather than waiting for the slower cogs to move at a Westminster level. But kind of it doesn't necessarily say anything that's that new, is how I would summarise the report, even if it's a reasonably neat way of setting it out.
Thanks, Gareth. And I'm glad you mentioned the success of road projects, because there is something I just need to correct the record on from earlier about the Silvertown Tunnel, where this morning we've seen data showing that it is having the impact of reducing congestion in East and South East London, and journey times are 70% quicker than they were, plus more people are using public transport as a result of it. So I just want to sort of correct maybe some of the data coming out this morning. We've spoken a lot about project pipelines and the fact that they are key to reducing costs as well. I know we've spoken at length here. This is an opportunity really to our panelists and guests about if there's anything more that you want to add to that.
I think there's something more about the boldness of those. We already talked about the what, but also the boldness about the how. So in other countries we're seeing is that, for instance, things like using modern methods of construction are mandated with a phased-in target. So say social housing, for the next 3 years, 10% needs to be done with modern methods of construction. In 5 years, 50% of all the volumes of housing developed needs to employ these kind of technologies. So that having sort of those kind of goals and making stronger demands of the supply chain to actually reform and drive innovation, I think there is something there that can go hand in hand with those kind of, pipelines rather than just having a view of what will the market size for construction in London or in other parts or nationally be for the next 20 years.
I'm conscious I don't want to throw so many new concepts and ideas for everyone to chew through, but I suppose part of this is you build up your evidence and things that are interesting to members you can pull out. But I thought I'd throw in another point, which is a factor that we can definitely improve on UK-wide, but certainly within London, which is about services, buried services and other services, surveying and that data and what happens to it. And actually, the costs of getting in and doing surveying of what the ground is like to build things, the extent to which that data is just readily available for everyone planning projects rather than having to be repeated for each new major scheme, is something that really very carefully needs to be looked at. And that's in terms of deep infrastructure and geology. Even at a buried services level, there is no unified buried services database that would allow a lot of saved costs. Let's go to Oxford right now. I have to be very careful, conscious of my employer, about what's going on in Oxford right now and the challenges with the construction happening there. But a lot of that is as a result of inadequate initial survey and a lack of I'm a bit jargon heavy, buried services and stuff, fiber optic cables, water pipes, the stuff that is, the 2, 3, 4, 8 centuries worth of human infrastructure that's piled underneath our roads and walking routes. And knowing where that stuff is and having that data ahead of design can allow you to do much cleverer design that then you don't have to unpick at a dramatic level once you get out and do some physical intrusive surveys. So that sort of thing would save costs. I think it's acknowledged in various reports that having a unified UK database of this stuff would be extremely powerful, but certainly London can get ahead on maintaining a more of an accessible unified database of some of this like key desktop information for knowing, right, where are the key services and how much will this cost, even for localized small stuff like putting a new physical bus stop in versus the big strategic metro line stuff as well. But there are definitely costs to be saved in sharing that information and having a better quality of that information that's readily updated, tagged and understood.
And to build on that, probably also, or you could think of a different model of delivering these projects. So Edinburgh Tram, we know the first one was a complete disaster. The extension from Newhaven to York Place, then finished on budget and on time, largely helped because all the utility diversions and the asset hardening, so, if you have pipes in the ground, if you run a tram over it, you need to put in bigger pipes so they don't get crushed because these trams are heavier than buses and HGVs and so on. So all of that was already done. So kind of that gives a lot of tailwinds, helps the extension project because the big risky stuff was already done. Same thing when we're looking at housing development, sort of at the central government level, they have the Housing Innovation Fund. Strangely mislabeled thing because it does neither housing nor innovation, but they take the risky bit of taking brownfield lands, decontaminating it, putting in the utilities, the infrastructure, enabling it for development, and then handing it over. Right? In a way that government doesn't have to do all of it. Government does the thing that would, so for instance, never attract private finance because that is way too risky, to take over some old plot of brownfield land and then probably finding all sorts of contamination on it. And as soon as you find it, then you have to deal with it, And so it's kind of that kind of thinking about us and, what would that be? Either, somewhere in London, somebody actually owning and having even that data available about, what is in the ground, but could we also then structure projects differently where, for instance, we say, actually, for these risky bits, we do public financing. That sort of is our project. We enable these things for then the private sector to start working on those afterwards.
I don't have much to add, but I do think that this is one of the areas where the UK kind of suffers from being first. We've built so many things in our ground, and we often don't have a map of what's there. So I was talking to someone who was a politician involved in building a local tram system, and he was telling me that I thought that we were setting out to build a new tram system for our city, but it turns out we're actually building a new utility network, because you kept finding things in the ground and you kept moving them. And then the way that we build trams, for example, we're building them double the depth than European equivalents. And no one could really kind of figure out why. It's not like there's a regulation. It's just seems like this is the way we do them. And we move all of our utilities, and we pay for all of the utilities to be moved. I'm sure Gareth might have some kind of added detail on this.
Yes, but I'll cut in and then you can cut back over me. But yeah, no, the legislative powers, the powers of the utility companies basically override the transport in this situation, so they can do what they like. And that will always... So the Coventry Very Light Rail, kind of the brand they use, system ostensibly was developed to get around that problem, Ben, that you're rightly highlighting of the level of civil engineering work we were doing for trams. Trams, by the way, are actually lighter on the road than buses and HGVs. That's one of the joys of them. But the utilities work, you have to do not so much about damaging them, although that's a factor, more about that you can't get to them afterwards because there's some tracks in the way. Well, the VLR project was theoretically avoiding that work because you could sit the tram on top. But the utility companies will just never let that happen because they want to be able to access their assets. So there is a bit of a legislative upside-down situation there, which is kind of one of the reasons that contributes to that point, Ben. Sorry, I just thought I'd cut in and punctuate that point.
No, that's very helpful. And just one final thing is tram companies are liable for 92.5% of the costs of moving utilities. So there's no incentive for utility companies to say, oh, actually, no, you don't need to move that pipe, or you don't have to pay for new wires and new pipes, because they're only paying 7.5% of it. So it's a kind of massive windfall for them.
Yeah, that's where I think utilities have come up on this subject that we've been looking at over the last couple of days as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Looking at a section now on sort of the planning and preparation phase, Assembly Member Clark.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, we've covered most of this pretty well, but when we're thinking about low-cost project delivery, I mean, clearly what I'm picking up from all of you is that we have not just regulation, but we've got a planning system that's quite complicated. We have utilities. We have all sorts of stuff that happens that seems to not just cost lots of money, but also cost time. And I'm just my question is really, what's the trade-off here? So is there a way we can plan better, organize better ahead of these projects so that it makes it quicker on the back end?
So I think it can absolutely be sped up, the planning system, and the kind of delays they already do add costs. So if you go back to the Bakerloo line example, if you really get a serious commitment from whoever wins the next mayoral election, it'll be delivered in 2040 or so. And the first consultation on the route was in 2014, and the first appearance in a transport strategic report was in 2006. So the entire timeline to build 4.5 miles of track is over 35 years. There are literally glaciers that move faster than that. So right now, getting planning permission to build takes around 3.5 years in the case of the Birmingham East Side Extension tram route. And the prep takes more than 2. Environmental impact assessments can easily run to 5,000 pages for these 1 or 2 mile extensions, so kind of nearly the length in paperwork as the actual building. And all of this just adds delay, it adds uncertainty, and it also means that the politicians that are elected to bring forward these schemes won't be in office to open them, so they kind of stop caring about the accountability and stop caring about driving it forward.
And to add to that, so our mantra and what we see and what we also see in a lot of the research is that kind of idea of thinking slow to act fast. You accelerate project delivery not by cutting short the planning of it. And it is that planning and that design for productivity and for speedy delivery that is key. So what happens, however, in reality is that, yes, I think theoretically you should be able to get a development consent order in 18 months. Sort of that's the minimum it will take if everything goes exactly to plan. But that's 18 months where sort of the project needs to prepare for things. And I think that's the other thing, that we're underinvesting in the planning phase and we're not doing the right things because these are protracted timelines. And so very often what happens, a scheme looks at There's not enough funding there. Okay, it goes back into the cupboard and accumulates dust. So, and then, next time it comes up again, let's look at it again. Or there will be a lengthy consultation process. I'm sure that all the people that were initially involved in the design work on the Bakerloo line have gone to other projects in between. All that knowledge is lost because there is that protected process that stops and starts at random points, which is not helping with this thinking slow, acting fast, because actually nobody's doing the thinking. It just sits there, just slow. I think that's a big element of that. And another element to that is on the planning or the consenting process, where we've seen some really serious reforms. Singapore has done it, Hong Kong has done it. A singular office, a singular authority where all applications go to. And then that office is in charge to then deal with what needs to be negotiated with the fire services, what needs to be negotiated with whoever is a stakeholder needs to consent to these plans. They have a timeline, a predictable timeline. In Singapore, it is, I think, 3 weeks. So if you're a developer, public or private sector, send your plans to that office. In 3 weeks' time, you will get a unified response. You have to deal with one instead of like 20 different interfaces. So it's both more predictable when you get an answer, not what the outcome is, but it simplifies and takes a lot of the friction out of that system for the people developing these projects. And it's simply a government entity that then just deals with the friction on the other side, but they do it more regularly.
That's really good. And it sort of points back to something Assemblymember Georgia was pointing out about consultation and kind of the engagement part of the planning process. I think sometimes when, you have a planning application and then it's 4 years until there's a spade in the ground. The thing is about a place like London is a lot of the people then living near there won't ever remember a thing about this. I mean, it was like nothing to do with them. So it does feel like quicker delivery from planning does, it makes sense on all sorts of levels. I mean, both for cost, but also in terms of, people feeling like the thing that they agreed to is now actually happening, and it kind of increases momentum. It seems like it's good for everyone.
Yeah, and as Ben said, right, because if you do this faster, not a lot of things will change.
Yeah.
Now we had COVID, and suddenly everybody says, well, any future urban transport solution definitely needs to talk about working from home and whether that is a thing or not until we all forget about it again, right? So there's kind of those things where the needs shift. And in that. And there's another thing which I really like. In Ireland, particularly in Dublin, if there is roadworks in front of your house, you get €2,000. Just it. It's it. And actually, what sounded insane is saving so much money because you're taking all the complaints out. So it's not like we will have roadworks and then you say object to that and you complain to that and you phone a hotline and there's lawsuits about whether there's damage to the property. If there's serious damage to the property, of course, right, that will be inspected, etc., and be good. But in the first instance, yes, we're going to tear up the road in front of your house for the noise and for the inconvenience. Here's €2,000. Right? For the road authority over there, Transport Infrastructure Ireland has saved an insane amount of money. Because it just takes the pain out and takes away that it's negative, etc. And all the admin and the lawyers that have to deal with every single complaint that later comes up.
That's fantastic. Gareth.
Yeah, sorry, I'm bouncing around like a maniac in the background. So I want to say a few things from coming back to my kind of career experience, and a thing that maybe is useful to sort of outline, which is depending on the type of infrastructure you're building, the survey, so that's where you've gone out, put your total station out, worked out, created your 3D model of the world as it is, and then designed to create what the world will be. You have to redo that survey either every 6 or 12 months, depending on the, for certain levels of detail, because of, in a city like London, everything's changing. The ground itself is moving around as buildings go up and down and so on and so on. So just on survey alone, if you're doing that, if that work, if you're not firing the starting gun on that work until after the actual individual project has got the go-ahead, then you've got to do the design itself, because the design doesn't just happen in an instant. Designing a complex railway system, or even a fairly straightforward one, takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of skilled people. And so if we are waiting for the starting gun on an individual project to go before we start even outline design, then that's adding, we don't even have the answer ready to take to planning for 12, 18 months with a tailwind. So the good thing about what we've talked about with strategy is that if you have a picture of what you expect the infrastructure needs of the city to look like, that can flex and change. But if you have that strategy, you can then do a lot of design work for those various things that get you to a level of outline design in advance of the actual starting gun being fired, so that rather than then waiting for 2 years to get to the planning point, you have enough of a detailed answer that you can start those questions earlier. You can start those basically when the gun is fired, which is, echoes exactly what Ben and Alexander have been saying. There is a lot, and this actually comes back a bit to the Arup report that was alluded to. This work can and should be happening in parallel and is enabled to do so if you have that strategy. If you have, to all intents and purposes, a map on the wall that says, well, we know all this infrastructure will need to exist to satisfy our big targets and the requirements of mobility in 2040, 2050, those infrastructure, and then you can therefore get that design work happening already, even if you haven't got the projects funded, which means that you start running activities in parallel, you bring those timelines in. So that just shows how much the strategic picture is extremely important to allow this work to happen in parallel, so that you're not just basically going end on end. Well, we finished this work and then we have to do this and then we have to do this, and then it just disappears off into the distance. So there's a lot of work that we can do and should be doing in parallel to get those things happening more quickly.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. I think that concludes most of our questions. I've got a couple of questions just to finish off. One is a really exciting one about contract structure. We may have covered this already, but is there anything about the structure of contracts that would help reduce the cost of delivery, other than things that have been said already in terms of multiple levels of subcontracting and certainty of delivery and so on? Alex, I see you leaning forward.
Yeah, I was thinking, because we talked in the break about this as well, and one of the big changes I think would help dramatically is a clear differentiation between liabilities and risks. So while we might be able to transfer the management of risk to the people who actually do the work on site, etc., because they're placed to manage those, they're not necessarily the people that should carry those risks. So Terminal 5 was the first one to discouple that. Thames Tideway obviously has a much more interesting arrangement around these things. And because if it is following that kind of firm fixed price contracting model, then risk will be priced in by the supply chain in anticipation that things will go wrong and they will have to pay for this, right? And that is driving up cost. And same thing, sort of if you look at TfL, because that came up earlier, for the bank capacity upgrades, they walked away from this classic model because they have always procured in this way that their supply chain is constantly carrying all the risks, and then suddenly, once they actually do something differently, there is room there. So that's certainly an element where that kind of commercials can really play a role in this, that we need to think about is what for the targets that we have, or objectives that we have with this project and the risk profile of this particular project, what is the right commercial strategy? So, and I have to say, the world's getting better at that. So we're seeing much more intelligent commercial models, but there is still a lot more we can do about that.
Thanks. Gareth?
Actually, Alexander said exactly what I was going to say, which is that we need to just make sure we're at the state of the art in terms of contracts, ensuring we're using the latest NEC models, but also, the engineering contracting models. But also, I was going to echo exactly those points on risk management. So, nothing to add on that.
Thanks. Ben?
I think the one thing to add is that you need to make sure that you have flexibility should the unforeseen happen. And if you're kind of digging a tunnel in London, you never know what you might come across. So you can't necessarily put a fixed cost on it. And we often see when you're kind of heavily reliant on fixed cost and trying to offload the risk, if something unforeseen happens, then you very easily get into contract disputes and work shutdowns, and suddenly no one's winning from this. Everyone's just worse off and you're not building anything. So Madrid was very good in that they had the ability to add kind of a little bit of fixed cost, but then a little bit of flexibility should other things come up in a bill of quantities. So it's like one engineer's day is worth this much. We had to add 20 more engineering days. We'll pay that. Agreed. Fine. Very quick. And then one other thing is Madrid, when they were considering the breakdown of how to weight different bids, only 30% came down to actual final cost. 20% was on speed, and 50% was on the technical merits and experience. So not just kind of a race to the bottom of trying to get the lowest cost bid, which then, once the competition is eliminated because you've selected them, they can then raise change orders and get into disputes. You're actually making sure what you're procuring is both cheap and quick, but also of a sufficient quality to actually get the job done.
That's interesting that the race to the lowest cost is not simply about the race to the lowest cost. Sorry, Alex, did you lean forward? You were about to add something else?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that, and yeah, absolutely echo or say the race for value is not the race for lowest cost. That's probably the better phrasing. The second thing I wanted to add to that is that we're overemphasizing the profit motive of the construction supply chain. Because if you run a construction company, yes, profit is one thing, but even more important is cash generation. So if you think about Carillion, they went bankrupt because they ran out of cash, not because they didn't make enough money. They just didn't make it in the right timing. So cash generation is equally important. So, and therefore, you can say to somebody, listen, here we have a contract that does target costs, so we incentivize you for cost savings, but that ultimately takes away from the cash that company will generate for their owners. You know, if I'm the contract manager on that, on the supplier side, I'll get fired if I don't generate the cash for the business, right? So an alternative model has been proposed in Norway and has worked reasonably well. They call this the reduction list, and the GFT is here talking about them as the Norway list these days. And this is that every project at the point of the final business case needs to have a list of reductions and additions. So if you're running out of cost, here is the scope that will be cut. And if we are saving on cost, here's the scope that will be added. The great thing about this is that this is done before procurement, so you get better prices, more realistic value for any reductions. It's also designed into the project so that you don't have to do tons of redesign once you need to cut costs. And colleague at the National University in Stavanger went through those lists. They are about 10 to 20% of the total cost of the projects. They're quite chunky. And 8 out of 10 transport infrastructure projects in Norway have made use of these options. So that is keeping that kind of flexibility and bringing it into the design, into procurement up front, and is clearly making sure that, look, suppliers, we understand, yes, not just profit motive and you get extra bonuses, it's also cash generation targets. And if you save us a lot of money, make a really good project, here is where that cash could go otherwise, you know, landscape improvements, etc., etc. And that strikes a much better commercial balance than our obsession always about is in carrots and sticks around profit targets.
Okay, final question then from me, maybe a bit provocative. So I was struck particularly, Gareth, you said earlier, you got the sense, and I suppose we got the sense through this meeting, that everyone's quite clear. There's a very clear understanding of what needs to be done, what good looks like. And so I suppose my challenging question is, why then, if it's so clear what needs to be done, have we not done it? And usually that leads me to think that there's perhaps some other hidden obstruction, hidden motivation that somebody somewhere has that is stopping the thing that everyone thinks needs to happen from happening. So what are the real world obstructions that mean, or that would prevent this wonderful and interesting meeting that we've had just becoming yet another report on a shelf? Gareth?
Yeah, look, I've made my bed now. I better lie in it and give that answer. Look, I'm going to structure this positively, which is, look, I can't just sit here and say, well, the way to solve this problem is to abolish the Treasury in its entirety, although that is true. But in all seriousness, I think we should look at where there are positives, and the devolution bill is a key factor in pushing us in the right direction to put power closer to the people who manifest the results of that power. And see its benefits, as it were. So devolution bill is a key part of it, but particularly in the things that Ben and Alexander have talked about in specific omissions of the powers that cities have. And as I often say, it's not just London. Like, London should have no more or fewer powers than the other major cities in the UK. Just happens to be that London's the biggest city, so can leverage those differently. But actually, we want to see what London does well rolled out to the rest of the UK. And in a way that might, where you have smaller cities that are leaner, you might see, Manchester's smaller, very big city, but relative to London, smaller. You might see lessons coming back from those smaller cities where they have been able to be more lean, come back to London as well. So there are benefits to the powers that London have not being unique to London, and those actually being sent around the rest of the country. But yeah, TWAO, Transport Works Act order powers, ability to raise local finance to a greater extent, those powers, there's still not good clarity on financial powers and devolution of those powers in the bill as we've seen it, and I want to see more of that clarity, and indeed further bills to follow up on that to increase those devolved powers. In doing that, we will allow cities to achieve a lot of what we've talked about, I think.
Thanks. Ben?
So I think there are 2 points to make. One, which kind of Gareth mentioned about incentives. So literally just having a politician who's accountable, who has the powers to deliver, and in turn can drive a project forward. But the other thing is we have to be quite ruthless against everythingism. So our transport projects are for saving the environment and for getting people around and for regeneration and for, well, like everything. And all of that sounds very nice and all of that is a good. But when you add it on top of each other, you often get, they're serving kind of many different goals, and in the end case, you don't serve really anything. So you have to kind of continually campaign against things that sound nice, and these nice things end up adding extra costs and end up actually delaying the core reason of the project from delivery. So to take a kind of concrete example, we don't build a lot. So when we do build something, we try and force it to achieve so many different goals. So Crossrail 2 is building a line between Chelsea and Hackney, which has been kind of in transport planners' dreams for decades. But it's also then connecting multiple railways and running a tunnel through the centre of London. And we want it to relieve the Northern Line, and we want it to kind of run through the most expensive parts of the city centre and add capacity there. So all of these different goals we've kind of stitched together, and we've got a bit of a Frankenstein monster project that then becomes so expensive that it's impossible to deliver. And there are small things that add up costs as well along the lines. We've kind of heard them before. It's, oh, well, why don't you just run another consultation? You know, maybe that will help. Maybe you ask people for their views again, and maybe we'll get something more valuable. And like, yeah, consulting people is very good, and it is nice. But do we need to do it like 7 times? I don't think there's value in that. So you really have to be ruthless against these nice things that add costs and delay and ultimately make a project undeliverable. And I think the way to do that is empowering mayors as the kind of people who deliver, and then judging them, are you able to actually deliver at the next election?
Thanks very much. Alex?
And demand that kind of transformation from the sector and the industry at the moment. So it's not just, I think that, yes, we already mentioned it, lots of good reports written, you know, a lot of the things that we've brought up as well, you know, sort of have been mentioned here and there, etc. But it is really about bringing it together and demanding that change of actually, you know, that it's not just about things in this country that we always moan about, which is cost control and schedule control and things being too late and over budget, that should stop, but how that is actually achieved and that the actors changing how they're delivering these capital projects, I think that's the main thing we haven't done, is to ask for that. We only have put out all these reports and in the hope that they will, you know, if you put something shiny out there, they will read it and they will listen, but maybe we need to ask them to actually listen.
Understood. Okay, well, thank you very much for all of our 3 guests this morning. And if there's anything else that as you're walking out of the building, I wish I'd mentioned that, you can absolutely write to us and let us know and add that to our record. But otherwise, thank you very much to Alex and Ben and Gareth for their answers to our many questions this morning. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion and delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with the party group lead members to agree output arising from the meeting? Can we note the committee's work programme and its dates? And can we note that the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 18th of September 2025, 10 a.m. here in the chamber in City Hall. Oh, no, actually, you don't have to agree that. That's just already a fact. Therefore, I have no further business this morning, and that ends today's meeting. Thank you.
Bye.